So first of all, I want to say thank you very much. It's a great honour to have Bill here as one of the 2.5 million people that read his blog every day. Is it 2.5 million? I feel very privileged to be here in his presence. And thank you also for discussing reframing, because it's very, very current here. What's so extraordinary to me is that the Labour Party hasn't learnt about framing yet. Doesn't seem to understand it. Doesn't use framing or reframing. Hasn't read George Lakoff, for example, when every politician in the United States has read Lakoff and understands Lakoff, and when George Osborne understands Lakoff very, very well. When George Osborne starts talking about the Tory party as the workers' party, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what he said, but he's now talking about workers an awful lot. Yeah. That shows you George Osborne understands framing. So it's a great tragedy for us that these lessons are not learned here. And that we're therefore stuck in this neoliberal narrative. And I have to say that I think that Osborne is an extraordinarily, I hope nobody's here to quote me on this, skillful politician, because he has managed to turn the whole debate about the failure of the financial system. And Bill, we are living here in the belly of the beast, right? I mean, Australia's a long way away from this particular beast. And it's really hell in here because it's so difficult. He's managed to turn the whole debate about the collapse of the financial system, the responsibility for that failure, the impact of that failure on the rest of the world, into something that blames it on welfare users and the NHS and the government and the fiscal deficit, basically the government spending. And the Labour movement, in responding to Osborne, has become incredibly defensive. So instead of saying, oi, this is not the problem, there's the problem in the City of London, it's instead got and I include the National Health Action Party in this, in a sense, defensive of existing institutions, and so busy being defensive that he occupies all the territory. We've not got anywhere near the territory we should be in to attack him. We're defending our little bit of territory here. And of course we're up against not just him, but the media, Murdoch and the City of London, who are supporting him in this major assault on the state. So we've got our neck is in a twist here, and we really need to change that. But can I also say that for me, one of the really important things about the whole debate about framing, and you used a word once at one point, Bill, manipulation of the English language. I'm a little bit wary of manipulation of the English language. I'm quite in favour of framing, but framing has to reveal and has to reflect the truth and reality. And if we don't get that right, then we're doing what George Osborne does, which is to pretend the Tory party is a workers' party. You know, he's reframing, but there's a deep untruth behind that framing. And therefore it doesn't really resonate, and it shouldn't resonate, actually. So I think one of the things that I think is important for the left is that we get our ducks in a row, both in terms of our analysis, but also in terms of our facts and so on. And I don't think we have done that. We're all squabbling away here, disagreeing with each other quite a lot. And that, it seems to me, getting our narrative and our story right. And Bill, you're one of the great leaders of this, to help us get our narrative right, to help us get our facts right, to help us get the economic arguments right, so that we can make those arguments against very much more sophisticated people. I think that's what. But I just wanted to say that because I think there are still disagreements, and I'd quite like to discuss some of those disagreements this evening, that we need to thrash out so that we all know what we're talking about, and what we're talking about is actually, in a profound sense, true, in the sense of it, we're not making it up in the way that so much of what you say. So I'll hand over to Richard, but then I think we ought to encourage people to participate as well.
Well, it's nice to have a Thursday evening audience as passive as you. I spent the last 2 Thursday evenings talking to Jeremy Corbyn crowds. They're a bit more lively. But actually, there has been a reframing going on. and the reaction has been quite extraordinary. I've enjoyed today so far. According to Chris Giles this morning in the FT, I'm stupid. I think that was part of his attempt to reframe Corbynomics. Unbelievably, the Daily Mail did a review of Corbynomics and said they couldn't find much wrong with it. It's a strange world we're living in today. And then The Guardian phoned me up and I recorded a podcast for them. So, the media and I are having a strange day of reframing. But the point about all this is that actually we are at a point where, and I think this is what the merit of the whole Corbyn debate has been, which I found myself rather accidentally involved with as somebody who actually isn't a member of the Labour Party and is credited as the author of Corbynomics, which is a strange sort of circumstance to end up in. I suspect the Labour Party wouldn't have me either, which is one of the other strange coincidences. If I'd have applied right now, I'm pretty sure I'd have been rejected, which makes it even odder still. But we are at this point where we can actually talk about something different. And if Jeremy is doing anything important, that is it. I put forward the idea of people's quantitative easing. It takes time to get used to saying quantitative in public. There are people here who I know don't like it. There are some people here who probably do like it. The whole point about it was provocative. Now, why is it provocative? Because it challenges certain set assumptions. I've challenged the assumption about do we have an independent Bank of England? I've shown we haven't. I published the documentation that shows that. It is just not true that we have it. The quantitative easing debate of 2009 showed that Alistair Darling approved the types of investment I'm now talking about. There is nothing radical that Jeremy Corbyn is saying. Who repeated the approval? George Osborne. And yet they are flat denying it. 7/8 of the political narrative at the moment says that Jeremy Corbyn is wrong. He can't do this. But it's already been approved. We've got a situation where it's absolutely said outright we shouldn't be investing in new infrastructure, which is what actually I'm trying to achieve, create a debate about how we create new infrastructure. Now, do we need to do that by taxation? No, that's the whole point of what I'm saying. We do not need taxation to create new infrastructure. People's quantitative easing is the government creating money for that purpose. It fits into an MMT framework in that way. Now, I'm an accidental MMTer. I came to it, in a sense, by working it out from first principles. I started with things like sectoral balances, and I started working on that, and I started working on theories of money, and I'm desperately interested in taxation. And it suddenly occurred to me that actually out of all of that, as Bill has been saying, governments can create money. And if governments can create money, the only reason they need taxation is to stop inflation. They don't need it to spend. But that is intensely radical when it comes to tax. Because suddenly, if you don't need to tax for the purpose of raising money, all our narrative about tax changes. That logic of an efficient tax, which is one which raises lots of money or is particularly good at low-cost revenue raising, is nonsense. The only thing that's efficient about a tax now is, does it achieve your social purpose? Taxation suddenly is about a whole pile of other things. Redistribution of income and wealth, repricing market failure, ratifying the value of money. That's a whole MMT theory, if you haven't thought about it. Why does money have value? Because you have to pay tax in it. You actually tax to make sure that the currency that you want to be used in your economy so you can manage it is actually the one that people are going to choose. Otherwise, they might as well use the dollar, the yen, or whatever in the UK. No, you want them to use the pound because you want to be in control of your economy. So you have all these other reasons suddenly. You actually tax because you want people to actually be concerned about the democracy they live in and how it is managed and the social choices it will make, which are reflected in the taxation system that you're going to construct. So you actually use tax to raise the representation ratios in democracy. That's why people vote in general elections and know damn well that local council elections are pretty pointless because local councils can't, in that sense, tax. And what's more, 5/6 of what they spend in the average UK local authority is actually given as a grant and is not a taxation charge. So there is this innate understanding. But what we've got to do is liberate it. And we've got to start that very directly. So this morning, my debate, it wasn't much of a debate, it was more of us throwing brickbats at each other, to be honest, between me and Chris Giles, was he started off his argument with the claim, all taxation is extortion. And this apparently is a completely rational, sensible comment, which a left-wing economist working for a well-known international development organisation, government-sponsored, said, but that is standard macroeconomic theory, Richard. And I said, yeah, and it's crap. That's a technical term. It's complete nonsense. And I agree with Bill. In that sense, the economics profession is one that has failed us badly. I'm very worried about that because next week I'm going for my first job interview in 32 years. I'm applying to be an economist. I'm the only candidate, so I've got some chance. I call it 50-50. But you know, it's a worrying thing to have to enter the economics profession on that basis because there's so much nonsense talked. And so I entirely agree. What we have to do now is actually be bolder. And I don't think, and I'll be blunt about this, and because I'm not responsible for everything that Jeremy Corbyn says, he has said some things about, you know, we've got to close the deficit. Yeah, Jeremy, I do agree. I've always agreed. But actually, that's an accidental side effect of actually creating full employment. No, you go for the jobs first. Keynes said that. Solve unemployment and the budget, I'm using the term budget here, not deficit, or whatever you wish to call it. But those problems will solve themselves. That's what you have to do.
Not with an external deficit, it won't.
Well, actually, there again, I've tried for ages to argue that there is no chance whatsoever that George Osborne can balance the budget at the moment. Has anybody looked at the UK sectoral balances? I know you have, Frances. I know you have. And I recommend Frances' discussion on it on her blog, Frances Coppola's blog. Please look at it, sectoral balances. Because at the moment, we are running an impossible situation to balance the UK budget. If George Osborne was to actually, by 2020, run a surplus, it will require UK households to have the biggest level of borrowing that they've ever had, higher than 2008. UK business has got to borrow 60 billion a year to fund investment, and it hasn't borrowed since 2003, and 60 billion would be a higher rate of investment than it's ever done since 1980. It's not going to start doing that, particularly after China's just decided to go and do a wobble. And what is more, our net imports have got to fall dramatically. We've got to start exporting heavily. That's really going to happen now China's done a wobble, isn't it? Those are the three conditions of us running a budget surplus right now. That is Osborne's requirement to get to zero borrowing by the government. His probability of achieving that is zero. But you need to understand that, because until you understand these very basic things like sectoral balances and how money works, which most macroeconomic theory doesn't even address, you can't take part in the debate. And that's why we need to change the debate, the language and the tone that we used and say, he's talking nonsense. Because he can't achieve it. We need to call him out. And that's why I've been involved, right or wrong, in helping Jeremy Corbyn create an economic policy for opposition. That means that the opposition has to say, we've got a better plan, we own it, we can deliver it, and it's much better than yours. And what's more, when yours fails, as Osborne's inevitably will, we can put ours in place. Now that, I think, is actually part of the narrative building as well. We've got a better plan, and we've got to tell the world what it is.
Great. I'm coming back to sit in the chair, to be a chair. Okay.
You're going to have someone carrying a microphone around?
We are. We've got Anne on this side with a mobile mic, and Prue here, who are going to come up the two sides. And if there are any questions, can we start the questions?
Two examples of
Sorry, could you start by saying who you are, please?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Graham Hunter. Two examples of language being changed is the Tories no longer talking about denationalisation, but talking about privatisation, and George Osborne choosing the living wage rather than the minimum wage. Just a comment. But my question to Bill is, what are the agencies and institutions that are key to the success of a progressive government operating MMT policies, and how is their role different to the current role?
Well, look, we haven't got much time, have we? Look, in Australia we have this thing called Centrelink, which is the agency that manages the privatised labour services contracts. So the Australian government is the OECD darling in the sense that they were the first ones to outsource the management of the unemployed to private sector contracts. And Centrelink is the government agency that sort of oversees that. So you've had this whole evolution of the public service from service delivery to contract management. And one of the things I often say about neoliberalism, it created a new industry. It's an industry that's totally unproductive, but it's a new industry, and it's the management of the unemployed. And that's the same in most countries that had previously full employment mediated through a welfare state. And the bureaucracies have changed from being service delivery to contract managers. So the first thing I would do in Australia would be to get some paper and go out on the front sign and change Centrelink to being the job guarantee agency. And then I would, as Prime Minister, announce immediately that anybody who wants a job can turn up to the job guarantee agency and you'll get a job in a productive public service. So first of all, we've got to, and that might sound flippant, but what it means is that we've got to get out of this appalling situation where the so-called major service delivery agencies are really just contract managing privatised, outsourced service delivery, which creates new industries rather than provide any public services. The second major change I would have, one of the big attacks, say, in the Australian context when the global financial crisis came, the federal government, to its credit, didn't panic, and it was quite extraordinary. Took a very pragmatic, and this was replicated in most Western countries, took a very pragmatic decision to ramp up fiscal deficits and implement stimulation packages. And the Australian government did it early and did it big, and we were I think about the only advanced Western country that didn't have a technical recession during the global financial crisis. And it received a lot of criticism because some of the schemes were problematic, like a national scheme to insulate all households as a climate change but employment creation. It was a spectacularly successful employment creator. But 4 people died because of dodgy private contractors who got service delivery contracts who didn't train their workers properly in putting this insulation into roofs. And what that lesson taught me is that if you want to have a strong progressive government in producing national infrastructure projects that are able to be ramped up when you've got a downturn in private spending, then you need to have a very well equipped and trained federal bureaucracy or national bureaucracy that is skilled in service delivery. And the third major thing, other than about 1 million others, is that I would close all central banks, merge them with the Treasury. The central bank does virtually nothing productive that a division of Treasury couldn't do. The central bank just has to manage the liquidity in the economy each day, and it has to provide prudential oversight to maintain financial stability, in other words, so that the private banks don't go broke. That you don't need a central bank to do that. If you float your currency, you don't need any official intervention. If you run a near zero interest rate forever, you don't need very much liquidity management. And one of the things I say when we have this myth of central bank independence, every single day of the working year, the Treasury and the central bank communicate about the implications of federal net spending on the liquidity system, the state of liquidity in the economy each day. Every day they're on the phone together because they've got to work together Otherwise, the central bank won't be able to maintain its target monetary policy. In other words, manage the interest rate, because if it loses control of the daily liquidity in the banking system, it can't manage its interest rate targets. So every day they've got to work together and talk to each other and make sure all of their decisions are mutually compatible. There is, and that's quite apart from the fact that the elected government appoints the boards and the governors or whatever they're called. That's obvious. But on an operational sense, they're always communicating and working together. So I would just do away with central banks. I would do away with the other corollary of that is to do away with all of these debt management agencies, because I would stop issuing public debt, because public debt is just corporate welfare. It just provides the corporate sector with a guaranteed risk-free asset of no productive value to the rest of us.
Oh, I think I'm going to disagree with Bill on that one, if I may. Am I allowed to?
No.
Yeah. I've worked in Africa most of my life. I've worked in Nigeria. I've worked in countries where the relationship between the politicians inside the Treasury and the central bank is deeply unhealthy. And I have very, very real reservations about giving politicians, because the Treasury is run by politicians, and I accept completely that the central bank's not independent. Of course it's not. Mr. Carney was very carefully chosen by Mr. Osborne, mainly because of his record at Goldman Sachs and so on. So I accept that the central bank is not independent, but I don't accept that we should give politicians the power to write checks, basically, because that's what they do in Nigeria. And it's a problem. So I just want to say that on the one hand.
Just let me respond. The foundation of democracy is that the voters elect their officials to represent them, and if we don't set up processes that allow us to trust that system, then we jeopardise our democracy.
Well, I mean, that's precisely, our democracy is jeopardised, and it's jeopardised in Nigeria, I can assure you.
Of course, because they don't have very sophisticated education systems.
They don't have trust, and they don't have the institutions for upholding that trust.
That's right.
And they need to have institutions like, for example, a judicial system and a criminal justice system, which would take their politicians to jail, and they don't have that.
Yep.
But that's not accidental. You know, the politicians make damn sure there's no judicial system and there's no criminal justice system that can do that work. So I'm merely saying that we need to be careful about that. But there's a second economic point I want to make, which is that we need transparency in this process, in the process of the bank, the central bank creating money. We need, or the government creating money, we need transparency in that process. But for me, the more important thing is that the government and the central bank at the moment are concerned only with one interest rate, the base rate. And for me, that's the least relevant rate in the whole of the economy. I started up a small business not long ago and set up an account with HSBC, and they said, this is fine, but you're a risky character, you're new. If you go into overdraft, we will charge you 28%. Now, if I were a small corner shop, and any small corner shop setting up in this environment is a very risky enterprise. The banks would be charging me unsustainable, and this is what's happened because the central bank and our governments have given up their ability to influence rates across the spectrum. They only worry about the base rate. For me, what's far more important are the rates that are being charged to businesses and firms and individuals across the whole of the economy. Not only banks benefit from the base rate. And in order to manage those other rates, does need to be, this is where I think liquidity preference theory is so profound and so revolutionary and so important, because Keynes was determined to manage interest rates across the spectrum of lending, not just at the base rate. And to do that, of course, when he talked about look after employment and the budget will look after, he did that in the context of having capital controls effectively. And capital controls are something that I think are also absolutely essential in a democracy and an economy where you know the government wants to exercise control over interest rates as a whole and not just the base rate. So for those reasons, I think we need the offer of assets such as government bonds across a spectrum of liquidity preferences in order to be able to begin to influence and govern interest rates across the spectrum. So I think we need to work that out, because I'm quite worried about this idea of merging the central bank with the Treasury.
Which is itching to.
Itching? I wasn't itching, I was desperate. I said on Radio 4 on Monday morning, I was asked by the reporter, what would I do if I was Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England refused to do people's quantitative easing? And I said, I'd tell him to catch the next plane. And I meant that, because I actually do not believe there is any role for a Governor of the Bank of England to say no to an elected government. For heaven's sake, in 1910 we stopped the House of Lords objecting to democracy and the control of the economy by an elected government. Now we can't accept that the Bank of England can put that control back in place. No, that's history and we can't have that. Actually, I've written a whole book pretty much about the institutions that I would like to be put in place to actually achieve these changes. It's called The Courageous State, and I gather that my publisher has got some copies outside, so I'll give that a merciless little plug. If you want to know the tax reforms that I would like, well, I've got another book coming out. That's published on the 1st of October. That's called The Joy of Tax. If that isn't reframing, I don't know what is. But I genuinely believe it. I think there is a joy in tax, and it actually embraces MMT quite significantly in the process of doing the arguments. But let me go back to fundamentally. What would be the one big change I would like? The argument is courageous politicians.
We'd all like that.
We have cowardly politicians, and they are what has been produced by the neoliberal state. Every time they see a problem, they think the market has got a better solution to this than I have, and so they turn round and run away from it. I simply believe we actually now have to have politicians who believe it is their job to say on behalf of the people who elected them, we can solve this problem on your behalf, whether it be unemployment, whether it be the lack of capital for small businesses, which is a fundamental problem, which is what one of the things I'd like a national investment bank to look at, and I think it should be looking at, because there is an obvious lack of problem for that business sector in the UK economy. But it requires people to stand up and say, we can. And although some politicians have used that phrase, I'm afraid to say most have simply carried on in the old mould. We need to reframe it, that we don't have politicians who run away, but politicians who actually head charge into the problem and say, I can solve this because I believe this state has the right to do that on your part.
Okay, we've got a chap at the back there. Did you actually want to make a comeback on what was being said there? No. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right.
Okay.
It was answered.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, that's next there.
There's over here.
And then over here.
Two women over here. We want some women, please.
1, 2, 3, and then 4.
You've got to give the right one the chance.
Okay. All right. I'm Alex Douglas. I'm not an economist. I'm a lecturer in philosophy. I did appreciate how philosophical your talk was. At least I thought so at the start. I want to ask something about metaphors. Sometimes you use this distinction between live and dead metaphors. So it strikes me that the household budget metaphor is a live metaphor, right? You think about that and it conjures up all these moral feelings in you. There are metaphors, of course, that you can develop to give a much more accurate analogy for the operational reality. And Stephanie Kelton uses this thing with the bathtub and the taps being spending and the drain being tax. But that's kind of a dead metaphor. I mean, I don't have any moral feelings when I think about bathtubs.
I have warm feelings.
So I was just wondering whether, you know of any ways we can deal with that problem. It strikes me that a lot of MMT is hard to come up with live metaphors that inspire the same kind of instant moral reaction that the household budget does.
Let's do several questions.
Well, with all due respect, the bathtub analogy is one that I've disagreed with. Okay. And because we're referring to A bathtub we intrinsically think as a reservoir, as a stock, as a volume of water, whereas what people don't understand is that a fiscal deficit is a flow. It's not a stock. A stock persists. A deficit is exhausted every period that we think about. And so a much better analogy is a river with outlets and inlets, that it's flowing continuously and it can rise in level and fall in level. And we want it to be a certain level, whatever. But look, I'm not a social psychologist, and I'm certainly not a language expert, and that's why we need to, it's taken us a long time to develop what I think is an elegant and coherent body of macroeconomic thinking. And that's the only skill if anything, I've got. And so I need to team up, and I'm working on that, with people who understand human psychology and marketing and language to solve the problems that you raise. And I don't necessarily think, though, that having an emotional attachment to everything is reasonable either, because one of the disasters is to believe that your own intuition and experience and common sense can be dead wrong, and personal intuition can lead you desperately astray. And so making everything out to be something that we understand through our own experience is not an appropriate thing for a national government that's nothing to do with our experience. It's totally beyond our experience as a capacity and the opportunities it has with its currency monopoly. We've got no experience of that at all. And so everything that relates to our own emotions and our own sense of embodiment will lead us astray. So intuition and common sense can be very dangerous.
Okay, it's actually the very, very first person to put his hand up is at the back there. He's been waiting all that time. That question, please. And then we're going to come across it as you'll be next, okay?
Thank you very much. My name is Eddie. This ties into this last question about language. I want to see if I understand the idea that the surplus actually destroys wealth. Is that what a government surplus destroys wealth? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
Well, one of the problems then is the idea of making it clear who the money belongs to. Because of course many governments will say that they create a surplus so they can reduce taxes and give money back to people. So the idea, well, this is something I see you shaking your head, Richard. I want you to explain it to me. The idea of many people, most people, me, is that I have money and it's taxed, it's taken from me by the government. And if the government decides to cut taxes, I'm allowed to keep more of my own money. In a bigger scheme of things, of course, it doesn't quite work like that. But the popular understanding is that this is my money, which is taken by the government to do stuff. So how do you break out of that? How do you reframe that very basic relationship?
The difference about public spending on national health service, the amount of money you're paying to. I'm going to do something a little odd now, I hope you don't mind, as the chair. Because I'm from the National Health Action Party, I can give you a very, very specific and concrete response to your question. If the state is paying on your behalf for a national health service, it will cost you, let's say, something in the region of £2,500 a year in order for them to invest in that national health service per head of population in order to actually make sure that everybody is well served. If you were to work on this idea of having the surplus, the sectoral balances, then you as the private citizen are going to have to replace that money. It's going to have to come from your personal pocket. And in doing so, it will cost you probably something like 3 times more than the state pays. So that's how you would lose. And I don't believe, Richard will talk about the tax, I don't believe that that would be balanced or compensated by the reduction in your tax that you would pay. Is that?
You know, I actually go back to Adam Smith to talk about this one. It's a long time ago, 1776, but one of his 4 maxims of tax was that no person should be asked to contribute more than is necessary to the effective operation of a government. Why would you run a surplus? That's asking somebody to pay more than they need to operate the government. So in fact, it actually contravenes one of his most basic principles of tax, which is you don't pay more than is necessary. You would actually be asking someone to run a surplus more tax than is required, because a surplus is simply government spending less government income. Now, would you want to pay more tax than is necessary? I doubt it, because you just said you don't. So therefore, you don't want a surplus. So let's get that language cleared up. What you actually are asking for the government to do is to run a deficit, because you probably do want the services, you don't want to pay for them. That is the normal narrative. Let's be clear about it. That's what people want there to do. The formula is G minus T, and most people want G, which is government spending, to be greater than T, which is government revenue. And so therefore deficits to be normal. And that desire is met by the way the vast majority of the time we always do run deficits, or almost always. And that's really useful, because that spend by the government creates money. We talk about the deficit if it is something terrible. It's money. That's all it is. It's how we actually put government money into circulation that we need to underpin secure, reliable transactions in this economy. It is, if you want to save, the safest thing you can use for that purpose: government money. And that's why it's so helpful to run a deficit, because if the government doesn't run a deficit, there will be none of that safe, reliable asset for you to save in, which is an asset. So if you destroy the surplus, if you destroy the deficit, in fact, you run surpluses for long enough that there is no deficit or debt left, you actually have destroyed the basis of the wealth in the economy that is created from having government money, which is the securest, safest thing you can live in. Go and read a Jane Austen novel. What's her definition of a good husband? Somebody who owns government debt. Much the same now. True in 1800, true now. Go and find well, I'm not looking for a husband right now. But it'll be a recommendation if you were to look for one.
But you haven't actually reframed it. You've explained it in a really quite sophisticated way that won't play to the reader of The Sun.
It's money. That's the reframing. It's money. It is the basis of your prosperity. If the government doesn't create the money that guarantees that you can pay for the goods and services that you want day in, day out, at a value that you can be sure of, in a currency which you can find reliable, there is no basis for running our own economy. Somebody has to do that. It's the government, and the only way that money can be created is by running deficits. That's why we've done it since 1694.
For the Sun, I think we would just say, look, when there's a government surplus, the government's taking more from you in taxation, and when it has a deficit, it's giving you more. I think that's the way you'd explain it to the Sun. But even that won't work, I don't think.
So we haven't solved the problem yet.
A couple of introductory observations. First of all, Adam Smith was wrong. When you're paying taxes, you're not contributing to the government's capacity to spend.
I agree, but the logic's right.
No, it's not right, it's wrong. You're not contributing to the government's capacity to spend. We've got to stop thinking that way. You're giving up purchasing power and creating real resource space that the government can then spend into, but without inflation occurring. The second thing is that taxation is coercive. And so, Giles is right there. Taxation is a coercive activity.
No, it isn't.
That's imposed by the monopoly issuer of the currency to force the private sector into surrendering rural resources so that they can be used by the government to pursue its socio-economic mandate.
No, that's democracy, Bill.
Yeah, but democracy is coercive. Now,
I give up.
Now, can I be the government and you be the private sector? Is that okay? We've only got two people in this economy. This world's two people. So let's say I spend $100. Well, just forgive me for the currency unit. And I invoke a tax of $100 per year. Okay, so I buy your services in the private sector for $100. You deliver those services to me. I tax you $100. My fiscal balance is, at the end of the year, 0. I've balanced it. How much have you been able to save in the currency that I issue? No. So you have got no financial assets. You've worked. You've paid all your income in taxes. You've saved nothing. I've balanced a budget. First principle, the government balance is exactly equal to the, so the government balance here is exactly equal to the non-government balance of 0. Okay, so year 2, I spend $120. I don't change the tax. What's my fiscal balance?
20.
Deficit of 20. What's your balance, the private balance? You've got plus 20 now. You've saved 20 and you've got $20 of financial assets. Yes? Are we nodding?
We're not starting from the year 0.
Oh, well, you've got to start understanding basic propositions before you make them complex.
But that's not how people think.
No, we're getting the way you think, first of all. Because you're a soldier in the progressive movement. And you've got to get an understanding yourself. So after the second year, my deficit has been your surplus of 20. Hold on. Year 3, I get invaded by neoliberal morons. And I'm told that, that running that deficit is deeply dangerous. And so I say, okay, I'll only spend 80 this year. I'll still tax 100. After year 3, what have I just done? In year 3, have I run a surplus or a deficit? A surplus of 20. I'm spending 80, taxing 100. Now, where am I going to get that 100 taxes from if I've only spent 80 income of the currency into circulation? How are you going to pay 100 taxes whereas your income in year 3 is only 80? You've got 20 of financial assets that you've got to run down. The surplus has destroyed your wealth by 20, wiped it out. And if I continued, then I send you broke and I cause recession. And so the fundamental principle that we've then got to attach a language and some metaphorical narratives to is that the government deficit exactly equals dollar for dollar, pound for pound, euro for euro, the non-government surplus. And a government surplus is equal dollar for dollar to a non-government deficit. And if the non-government's running a deficit, then it's got to be running down its financial wealth and increasing its indebtedness. Now,
earnings from overseas?
well, what about earnings from? The overseas sector is just part of the non-government sector, and it just complicates the way in which we distribute those accounting relationships. It doesn't. You can't negate the accounting. Accountants here know that accounting adds up. That's not economic theory to tell you that a government surplus is exactly equal to a non-government deficit, penny for penny, dollar for dollar. Decomposing the non-government sector into an external sector and a private domestic sector just alters the way in which that deficit or surplus that results is distributed across national boundaries. It doesn't alter the fundamental principle. And so the fundamental principle is that a government surplus destroys non-government wealth. Has to. So then that sounds bad to me. And there's a whole lot of metaphors that can then be invoked that why do you want the government to be destroying your wealth and to be destroying your income? Why would you want that? And so you need to build up a narrative that even the highly intelligent Daily Sun readers can comprehend.
The maths of this, by the way, is quite well explained on the Wikipedia entry on modern monetary theory, and it's not complicated. It's easy to follow.
Sorry.
No, but it covers your point.
But my problem... All right, sorry.
So there's only like 10 minutes left. Is
Yeah,
it possible for the
exactly.
audience to
Yes,
speak?
absolutely. Yes.
I mean, not
yeah.
to
Yes.
not to
No,
diss
you're
what's
right.
going on.
I would like to move on, please. Over there.
Yeah, okay. I'm Barb Jacobson. I'm from Basic Income UK and also chair of Unconditional Basic Income Europe. I don't want to get into that debate right now, but obviously we're very much involved in trying to reframe the debate about work and what is work, and that it's not just the market that is, what the market pays for is work. What I'd like to suggest, though, also, really, is that we reframe neoliberalism as scorched earth economics. All right, I mean, neoliberal or neoclassical sounds far too respectable. Far too respectable. And, you sort of, the left kind of gets into this thing, oh, bad neoliberalism, and other people hear it and they don't even know what you're talking about. So yeah, so I just want to throw that comment out and hope that somehow it's taken up, because I'm really tired of hearing this very respectable sounding term used for an extremely disreputable set of ideas. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Fran from Positive Money, and thank you all for your talk. I think that I definitely agree with what Anne was saying, especially that everyone here is on the same page and we don't want to squabble even though we do disagree with each other. I think there's obviously what's just happened just shows how difficult it is to reframe the economy, basically, and reframe a narrative that is progressive. We can't get into sectoral balances, budget deficits, surpluses, whatever else. And I think that my argument would be is actually even talking about the deficit is not a good idea, because to reframe that is actually going to be really, really difficult. And I think that your starting point of talking, like obviously all the coverage you've been getting is great, Richard, on people's QE, but if you're just going to throw in that the new economics is about politicians printing money, that's just a non-starter for the progressive movement. And we all want to see these ideas be progressed rather than shut down immediately, which I think potentially will happen if you just kind of keep saying we just want the politicians to create money, and we'll put Mark Carney on a plane back to Canada if we won't print enough money that we want him to. And so I guess one point I was going to make is one of the biggest downfalls of neoclassical economics is that it doesn't treat people how they really are, which is rational agents. And I feel that MMT does the same thing a bit when you kind of assume that there's this perfect democracy and that politicians will make the right decisions.
Louise?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Louise, and I'm a member of the NHA. I'm not an economist, and I'm more like a kind of ordinary person in that respect, and I'm trying to understand all this, and I'm also trying to argue for a different way of looking of doing economics. And I argue with a good friend of mine who has studied economics, and she just says these things like, well, printing money, and I don't really know how, money represents something. You can't just create more without it. You've got to say what does it symbolize, what's underneath it, what's backing it, if you like. And then she does talk about Weimar, she talks about Zimbabwe and other things, and I find it really difficult to counter that, because I do think money my idea of money is it represents something real, and you can't just make more and more of it unless it's backed by something real. So I'm saying this as somebody who passionately wants to embrace and argue these counter, but I really struggle with it. And I think that you're right. We all struggle. I think many people do, and I think we do have to nail that one. That's really all.
Money isn't real.
Yeah, that's it.
Money's virtual.
Yeah.
Not to the average family working up north on £80 a week.
No, I understand.
Yeah,
Very real. That's the problem we've got. Who are you reframing for?
No, it's for the family up north. What's real is what they can buy in the shop.
Exactly.
So it's backed by
But
real resources.
Yeah.
This is an intellectual debate. There are lives at risk now with where we're at in this country.
Yeah.
And who are we reframing for? Another book to sell? Or to wake up the public? I'm trying, like Louise, to sit here and understand. And I'm not. Because you're relying again, just like people in the NHS and with an NHS campaign, doctors, nurses start falling into the vocabulary that removes it from ordinary public. You are in danger of doing the same thing. So who are you reframing for? That's my first question.
It's a good question. That is the point. Yeah, sorting.
I often get asked that sort of question, and my response is that, and take this as I say it, but there's roles to play there's layers in the public debate, and there's different roles to be played in the exposition of ideas that form the public debate. And my particular role that I sort of defined for myself as an academic is somewhat distant from the person in the shop struggling to make their ends meet. Because the role of an intellectual or an academic is to create, the idealist role is to be a knowledge creator. And I have no capacity to come up with fancy marketing schemes or appeal to social psychology or do graphical design that produces beautiful logos that will resonate. We've all got to have different roles. And the person who's got the good graphical skills needs a person that has ideas and works out a body of theory. And it's not even my role to communicate necessarily my abstract theoretical concepts to the general public. That's a separate skill again. It's my role to try to work out really abstract ideas and then relate them. So I say money's virtual. That's a very abstract thing. I understand how difficult macroeconomics is. My role is to try to work out a coherent body of thought, and that I know can be the basis of a progressive agenda. But then there's all layers of other activists who interpret that knowledge that I've sort of sat behind in my little darkened office generating. So I'm not trying to reframe for anybody. That's not my role. My role is to give some weapons to counter the idea. So when someone says, "Oh, the government's going to run out of money," my role is to build a body of theory that tells you that it can't and what the implications of that body of theory are. Then someone else who's more skilled at dealing with at a different layer can then take that and work it into whatever they do. I don't know, posters and jargon and narratives and language. So it's, that's the way, my role's very narrow as an academic and as an intellectual. I'm not everything. I'm just a really small part of the cog. And I'm not an activist at all.
We are almost running out of time, I have to say.
Can we have these two comments?
I'm Frances Coppola. I have a couple of things here. One is a tweet that I've been sent, which I thought I'd pass on for everybody to think about, which it ties into something that Richard said. It's a quote from Alfred Mitchell Innes, written in 1914, from The Credit Theory of Money, and it says, "A dollar of money is a dollar because of the dollar of tax imposed to redeem it."
That's what you like, Alan. I just want to take issue with Bill slightly about something. I think it's a terminology problem more than anything, which is to do with government debt. Because I think that it's not just deficits that have a very negative connotation, but debt does too. And I have been on a mission for several years now to reframe it and say, can we please stop calling it debt? It's not, it's a savings scheme. We have to, it's the job of, one of the things that government has to do is to accommodate the fact that you and I want to save. It's a natural human thing, we want to save. And we want to do so in a way that is safe. We don't want necessarily to be putting all our life savings at risk. I certainly don't. So I want to be able to put my money somewhere where I know it's going to be safe. I'd also quite like it to be productively used, but I'm not the person to take that risk. So for me, one of the key functions of government is to make it possible for us, ordinary people, to save safely. You can call that debt if you want. I prefer to call it savings, but to say, oh, government should stop issuing debt does make me wonder how it is that people can then save for the long term. Maybe we need to have a different way of framing that, or use different terminology around it, so we see it more as the responsibility of the government to provide for its citizens, and less in terms of government is issuing debt to fund itself, which it certainly isn't the case.
Just create a national savings fund. And offer people financial assets that they can park their savings and give them an interest rate return that's competitive, and that's the solution.
Colin and I wrote a version of that called People's Pensions in 2002. I put it on the blog again yesterday. It is backed by this asset, the government's creation.
Sovereign wealth fund, it's a similar kind of idea.
Yeah.
I'm Jeff Tiley. I've read some stuff about Keynes amongst other things. Bill, just thank you for that presentation. I thought it was really, really great and really gripping. But I do want to challenge you a bit on this issue of framing, because it seems to me that you're a theoretician in your office, but you are getting into the business of framing. And you've decided, or you're championing doing this framing around deficits don't matter. Now I noticed when Richard mentioned the idea of, if you look after so Keynes's idea, his framing was if you look after the employment, the budget will look after itself. Now you instantly moved in and started talking about the current account deficit. Richard described it as accidental, I think he said. But for Keynes, that was his frame, that was how he framed the discussion, and I think we should think quite carefully, because he was successful.
Yes.
Within a couple of years the government was spending, so on the basis of that framing he got it working. There are theoretical issues here about the endogeneities and about effectively GDP. But the other question the other example I would give is the 45 Labour government. They inherited this god-awful mess, but they spent, and as they spent, they reduced the deficit, and they put the current account into surplus. So they were doing things, in terms of less, your more is up type metaphor. They'd found a way to deal with a lot of the problems on the basis of basically still Keynes's original narrative, I think. So I just, as Franz says over there, I don't want the framing debate to be a done deal, really, yet.
If you read all of the sort of 1945 just immediate post-war documents, the famous white papers, and which were the big grand statements of how the governments of the world were going to manage the peacetime, they don't talk about financial ratios at all. They talk about productive use of the population, expanding infrastructure, all of the sort of grand visions. And that was very, very much driven by what people like Keynes were saying, that all of these financial ratios, they're relatively irrelevant. And a government can't control a fiscal outcome anyway. Yeah. But you've made that point about endogeneity. For the general people here, that means that the final fiscal balance is really driven by our saving and spending patterns, the private sector. Because when we're spending strongly and the economy's growing strongly as a consequence, the government's revenue increases anyway and the fiscal balance declines, the deficit declines. The government can't target it's meaningless to target a fiscal outcome. And so what the narrative should be is about, you read those big white papers after the Second World War, full employment, social inclusion, best practice service delivery. There wasn't nary a mention of the fiscal deficits. And so I agree with you. I mean, my little nuance about what Richard said was that the deficit does take care of itself, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will go into surplus or balance.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
It does take care of itself.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to wrap up now, thank you. I'm really sorry, I think that as we've gone on, I've seen more and more hands go up, and I'm afraid that we have to call it an end, we have to draw things to a close. I really hope you've enjoyed yourselves, that at least for those of you who don't understand all the economics behind it, at least it's given you an idea that there's a serious challenge to be launched against the language that the government constantly uses, and I'm afraid to say not just the government, but successive governments over the last 30 years, and that we do now have a possibility for change. There is a feeling in the air that a debate can change, that a new language can emerge. I take your point, Stephen, what you were saying, that it feels very esoteric here perhaps this evening, but it's out of such things that things are born, I think. So I hope so, Lou. So I hope you've all enjoyed yourself, and thank you very much for coming.
And could you just all give it up for Deborah and Prue who put all this together?